Cape Colony, 1808. In the dust-choked dawn north of Cape Town, a man named Louis van Mauritius tightened the rope around his waist, not as a belt, but as a symbol of chains he was about to break. He was born enslaved, yet carried within him the echo of another rebellion. Haiti's cry for freedom. That morning, with a machete in hand and fire in his chest, he led hundreds to march toward the impossible, liberty. At the turn of the 19th century, the Cape Colony stood as a scarred land, where sunlight hit the vineyards and wheat fields, but never touched the hearts of those forced to work them. Though ruled by Britain after centuries of Dutch control, the colony remained chained to the same brutal economy: slavery. More than 29,000 men and women of African and Asian descent labored beneath overseers armed with whips and muskets. The masters called it order, the enslaved called it hell. In the wine cellars of Stellenbosch, in the wheat fields of Swartland, and along the salt roads toward Table Bay, their songs carried the same refrain: freedom is far, but it remembers our names. The British authorities promised civility and progress, yet allowed the same lashes that had cut through generations. Among those enduring this world was Louis van Mauritius, a man of mixed heritage, born from the Indian Ocean's tides of trade and bondage. He was no ordinary laborer. Louis had worked in households where he overheard conversations of governors and merchants, catching glimpses of a wider world beyond chains. He had read fragments of newspapers discarded by the masters, learned that elsewhere in the world men like him had begun to rise. Each night, as the overseer's dogs barked in the distance, Louis watched the stars above Table Mountain and whispered to himself, "If the wind can cross the sea, so can freedom." Cape Town glittered on the horizon, a city of whitewashed walls and clipped voices. Yet beneath its neat facades, tension brewed like the heat before a storm. Rumors of unrest spread through the plantations, whispers of revolt that the masters dismissed as drunken talk. But for Louis, every rumor was a spark. He began to speak softly to those who trusted him: field hands, stable boys, kitchen women, men who had once fought in distant wars for European empires they barely understood. He did not preach hatred. He spoke of dignity. "If they can command us with words," he said, "then words can unchain us too." By 1808, the colony seemed calm on the surface. But deep in the soil, something was moving: the slow, invisible shift of courage, taking root. In the year 1804, across the ocean, an event thundered through the world like an impossible dream. The enslaved people of Haiti, led by Toussaint Louverture, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, and others, had risen against France, crushed the colonial army, and declared a nation of their own. It was the first successful slave revolution in human history. When the news reached Cape Town aboard a merchant ship, it came disguised as a warning. Plantation owners whispered of barbarity, bloodshed, and black rebellion, but to the enslaved, the words tasted like prophecy. Louis heard it first from a sailor who had worked the docks, a man who had seen the Haitian flag raised above the ashes of the French Empire. "They did it," the sailor said. "They broke the chains." From that night onward, Louis was not the same. He shared the story in secret, not as rumor, but as revelation. In dim wine cellars and stables, he retold the tale of Haiti's uprising, as if it were scripture. The names Louverture and Dessalines became whispered prayers among the workers of the Cape. For the first time, they imagined that freedom was not a myth told by missionaries. It was a thing that men and women could take for themselves. In the dark, Louis's voice trembled with conviction. "If they can rise," he told his companions, "so can we." The idea spread like smoke across the estates of Swartland and the vineyards of Tygerberg. Even those who had never seen the sea began to dream of ships sailing north, not carrying captives, but carrying hope. Masters sensed something changing. They noticed fewer bowed heads, quieter mornings, longer silences when they barked orders. But they did not yet understand what those silences meant. Louis, however, understood perfectly. Silence was the breath drawn before a roar. By 1808, Louis van Mauritius had become more than a worker. He was a quiet conductor of rebellion. His calm manner and sharp eyes hid a dangerous secret. He had begun to organize. He spoke softly to trusted men in the vineyards of Swartland and the wheat farms near Malmesbury, his voice steady, his tone measured. In every conversation, he repeated a single question: what if the sun rose on a free Cape? With him were three men who would risk everything: Jacob, Abraham, and Hooper, each from different estates, each hardened by years of servitude. They met at night, in abandoned barns, or beneath fig trees, using the sound of distant jackals to cover their whispers. Maps were drawn on scraps of sackcloth. Words were passed by song, by gesture, by the simple act of looking one another in the eye. Their plan was audacious, almost impossible. They would march toward Cape Town, the seat of British authority, and demand emancipation. To do it, they would move from one farm to another, gathering workers as they went. No gunpowder, no cavalry, only machetes, clubs, and faith. Louis refused to let blood be the foundation of freedom. He made one rule: we do not kill unless they strike first. We are not beasts, we are men. His rebellion would not be of terror, but of dignity. He wanted the world to see enslaved Africans not as savages, but as people capable of moral courage. For months, preparations unfolded in silence. They collected food, sharpened tools, and waited for the harvest season when movement between farms would seem less suspicious. Louis's most trusted ally, Abraham, was assigned to spread the message along the coast, disguised as a laborer trading saltfish. Hooper gathered the men who tended oxen and wagons, for their skill would be vital in transporting supplies. Jacob, the youngest, was tasked with recruiting women cooks, washerwomen, and maids who could listen unnoticed within the master's houses. Each knew the cost. Capture meant torture, hanging, or worse. But when Louis spoke, the fear seemed to fade. He reminded them that Haiti's freedom had also been written off as madness. They said it was impossible there too, he said, until it was done. As spring of 1808 ripened, the plan was ready. The time had come for silence to break. The morning of the 27th of October, 1808, began like any other in the farmlands north of Cape Town. A pale mist over the vineyards, the faint cry of crows, the scent of crushed grapes in the air. But this dawn would not fade quietly. Louis van Mauritius stood before his followers, around 300 men and women from more than 30 estates. They carried machetes, axes, sticks, and farm tools turned into weapons of defiance. Some were barefoot, others wore rags tied around their feet. None wore fear. Louis raised his hand, and the murmurs ceased. "Today," he said, "we walk not as property, but as people." The march began in Swartland, the heart of the rebellion. They moved in lines, singing hymns and call and response chants that echoed through the valleys. With every mile, more joined them, laborers leaving plows, maids dropping buckets, herdsmen abandoning flocks. On each farm, Louis commanded discipline. Overseers and masters were disarmed, but not killed. Those who resisted violently were restrained. The rebels locked the captured in barns or storerooms, then moved on. They confiscated horses, wagons, and food not as thieves, but as soldiers feeding an army. By midday, the procession stretched for miles, a river of humanity flowing toward Cape Town. Some carried makeshift banners of cloth scrawled with words like freedom and justice. For the first time in Cape history, enslaved Africans and Asians walked openly, unmasked, under the sun, claiming the right to exist. Travelers on the road fled at the sight, believing an army from another world had risen. British settlers in the towns barred their doors and sent riders to warn the governor. Still, the rebels sang. They sang of home, of God, of oceans crossed, and generations stolen. For them, every step south was a step out of the grave. As dusk fell, they reached the outskirts of Salt River, just a few miles from Cape Town. Fires flickered in the distance, the glow of the city they dreamed to conquer without hate. Louis looked toward the horizon. "Tomorrow," he whispered, "we will speak to them as men." But unseen beyond the dark, the British troops were already gathering, muskets loaded, bayonets glinting like cold stars. The night air thickened with fate. By dawn, the rebellion had become a moving world of its own, a slow, rhythmic thunder across the dusty Cape roads. From Swartland to Tygerberg, they marched. Hundreds of men and women, their feet raw, their voices hoarse, but their spirits alight. In the pale gold of morning, they looked like pilgrims rather than warriors, pilgrims seeking a land that had never existed for them, a land where no one could be owned. Louis walked at the front, his machete tied to his side, not raised. His eyes stayed fixed on the hazy outline of Table Mountain. "That is where we will speak," he said. His companions, Jacob, Abraham, and Hooper, followed in silence. Around them, songs rose and fell in the rhythm of footsteps and heartbeats. They sang in Afrikaans, in Malay, in the broken tongues of the Indian Ocean. The polyphony of captivity turned into the hymn of uprising. Women carried water gourds, Children clung to their mothers' skirts. Elders walked barefoot with steady dignity. They passed through farms and vineyards, each stop swelling their numbers. Workers dropped their tools and joined the march. Some brought livestock, others carried torches. One old man dragged behind him a broken yoke, the wooden symbol of servitude he vowed never to wear again. Louis forbade destruction. No burning, he said. We do not fight fire with fire. His rebellion was a plea to be recognized not as monsters, but as men of conscience. He envisioned arriving at Cape Town not as invaders, but as envoys of justice. At midday, the heat shimmered on the horizon. Dust clung to their skin. Still, they walked through fields of grain and over stony hills, their songs now slower, more solemn. As they neared the outskirts of Salt River, some began to sense the tremor of danger. Scouts brought news of mounted troops ahead, soldiers of the British garrison. Louis paused the march. If they come with guns, he told them, we will not kneel. If they strike us, let the world see who fires first. The crowd murmured prayers. The sun dipped behind the hills, casting their faces in bronze light. Ahead lay the city. Behind them, the farms now emptied of labor. The Cape Colony itself had stopped to watch. For one suspended moment, freedom seemed only a few miles away. Night fell heavy over Salt River. The marchers lit small fires, their flicker trembling like fragile stars across the dark plain. Some prayed aloud, others sat in silence, their bodies exhausted but their hope alive. They did not know that a column of British troops was already approaching from Cape Town, muskets loaded, sabers drawn, orders cold and clear: suppress the insurrection. Before dawn, the air erupted with the echo of hoofbeats. The soldiers came in formation, horses snorting, bayonets gleaming in the first light. The rebels had no time to prepare. Louis rose to his feet, his voice cutting through the panic. Do not run, he shouted. Stand tall, even if you fall. A volley of gunfire tore through the morning. The sound scattered birds from the trees and sent men diving to the ground. Some rebels swung their machetes, others raised farm tools to block bullets. A few charged forward, shouting defiance before they were struck down. Abraham was among the first to fall, clutching his chest as he whispered Louis's name. Hooper tried to pull him away, but chaos swallowed the order they had built. Horses trampled the earth where prayers had been spoken. The air filled with smoke, dust, and screams. Louis stood his ground, refusing to flee. He fought not with the ferocity of vengeance, but with the clarity of conviction. Every blow he struck was a word, every parry a declaration. We were men before you made us slaves. But courage could not defeat gunpowder. Within hours, the rebellion collapsed. Dozens were killed or captured. Others fled into the marshes and hills. By midday, silence fell again over Salt River. The fires had died out, replaced by the smell of blood and smoke. Louis and a handful of survivors hid in the thickets along the riverbank. His clothes were torn, his hands blistered, his voice hoarse. Still, he whispered to those around him, we are not finished. Even if they kill me, they cannot kill the idea. Behind them, the soldiers marched their prisoners back toward Cape Town. Ahead of them, the sea shimmered, the same sea that had once brought chains to these shores. Louis looked toward it and thought of Haiti, of Toussaint, of freedom crossing the waves. Then he turned to face the direction of pursuit. He knew capture was inevitable, but surrender was not. For 3 days, Louis and the remnants of his followers hid among the reeds and forests north of Cape Town. The air was thick with humidity, the stench of blood still lingering on their clothes. They had no food left, only river water and the taste of loss. The British patrols combed the countryside, guided by local farmers and informants who feared another uprising more than they feared their own conscience. At night, Louis spoke softly to those who remained. We did not fail, he told them. We showed the world that the enslaved can stand without chains. His words steadied their trembling hearts. They had seen brothers die, friends captured, but in their leader's calm voice, something of Haiti still glowed, a quiet, stubborn light. But fate moved against them. On the 4th morning, as the mist lifted, the bark of a hound shattered the stillness. Soldiers followed its cry through the reeds. Before the group could scatter, muskets were raised. Louis lifted his hands. Do not fire, he said. We surrender. The soldiers bound them in iron shackles. Yet even in chains, Louis walked upright. He refused to be dragged. When asked if he was the leader, he answered, I am the man who spoke of freedom. If that is leadership, then yes. At the camp outside Cape Town, the prisoners were interrogated. The soldiers demanded names, routes, details. One by one, they were beaten, starved, and questioned. Not a single man betrayed another. When they pressed Louis hardest, he stared into the officer's eyes and said, "I have no army, only a dream." The authorities were furious. They needed a scapegoat, a body to hang as warning, and they found it in him. Among the captured was a young boy, barely 16, who had joined the march at Tygerberg. Under torture, he confessed that Louis had given the order to rise. Louis did not blame him. The boy had screamed in agony for hours before breaking. "Tell them it was all me," Louis whispered when they met again in the prison yard. "You are too young to die for my words." From that moment, there was no turning back. The rebellion was officially declared over. Its leader, Louis van Mauritius, would stand trial, not as a man, but as an example. The trial took place in Cape Town, in the high-ceilinged courtroom where the colony's elite gathered in their powdered wigs and tailored coats. Outside, a crowd of townspeople waited, whispering as the prisoners were brought in. Some came to see justice, others came to see fear restored. Louis entered in chains, his ankles bruised from the irons, but his spine straight. He wore a torn linen shirt, the same one from the day of the march. He did not bow when ordered to. Instead, he looked directly at the magistrate, a man who would never know what it meant to kneel unwillingly. The charges were read aloud: treason, sedition, rebellion against His Majesty's crown. Louis listened without a flicker of expression. When asked to respond, he said quietly, "If seeking freedom is treason, then I am guilty." Witnesses were paraded before the court: overseers, plantation owners, and the young boy who had been forced to testify. Each statement painted Louis as the mastermind, a dangerous agitator, a false prophet. But the truth hung between their words, trembling like a candle flame in wind. Fear. They feared that his courage would outlive his body. During cross-examination, one officer asked, "Do you regret what you've done?" Louis answered, "I regret that I was born to serve men who never learned mercy." The judge's gavel fell. The sentence was swift. Louis van Mauritius was condemned to death by hanging. He closed his eyes, not in despair, but in serenity. When the interpreter repeated the words in Afrikaans and Malay, Louis whispered a prayer under his breath, not for himself, but for those still in chains. That night, he was led back to his cell in the Castle of Good Hope. Through the iron bars, he could see Table Mountain faintly outlined against the moon. He thought of the march, of Abraham's laughter, of songs rising in the dust. When the guard asked him if he feared the morning, Louis smiled faintly. "No," he said. "The morning has always belonged to us." Outside, Cape Town slept, but in the darkness, something had already shifted, a tremor beneath the city's quiet stones. The morning of the 8th of November 1808 dawned cold and windless. In the courtyard of Cape Town's Castle of Good Hope, a wooden scaffold had been built overnight. Its beams were pale, freshly cut, as though the colony itself wanted the structure to gleam with false purity. Crowds began to gather: sailors, merchants, servants, and slaves, all summoned by curiosity or command. Louis van Mauritius stood at the center of it all, flanked by guards. His wrists were bound, his face bruised but unbowed. He had not slept, yet his eyes were calm, his posture firm. To the onlookers, he seemed less like a prisoner, and more like a man who had already crossed into legend. As he was led forward, a hush rippled through the square. The judge read the sentence once more: for rebellion, for treason, for inciting the enslaved to rise against lawful authority. The words were heavy with fear disguised as order. Louis spoke only once. Turning toward the crowd, he said, "You can hang the man, but not the truth." A murmur moved through those gathered. Even some of the guards lowered their eyes. Among the crowd were enslaved men and women forced to attend, their faces blank masks hiding rage and grief. Some bit their lips until blood came, so they would not cry out. When the noose was placed around his neck, Louis closed his eyes. For a brief moment, the wind shifted, carrying with it the faint scent of the sea. He thought of Haiti, of the songs they had sung along the march, of the men who had fallen at Salt River. He whispered, "We will meet again, where no chains hold." The trapdoor fell. For a long second, silence ruled the courtyard. Then came the sound, a collective gasp, a stifled sob, the uneasy shuffle of boots. The rebellion was officially dead. But something invisible began to stir. In the weeks that followed, the British authorities ordered mass arrests and interrogations. Dozens of participants were punished. Some were flogged, others imprisoned. Yet, among the enslaved, stories of Louis spread in whispers, tales of the man who had walked with his head high, who had faced guns with bare hands, who had dared to dream aloud. The masters tried to erase him from records. His name vanished from ledgers and reports, his body buried without a marker. But memory is soil, and rebellion, once planted, grows unseen. From farm to farm, workers began to hum the songs he had sung. His name was spoken in kitchens and fields as both prayer and promise. Louis van Mauritius was dead. But the idea of him, the sound of his voice, the sight of him walking unchained, would never die. History called it a failed revolt. But revolutions are not measured by victory, they are measured by awakening. Louis's uprising of 1808 did not free the Cape Colony, yet it cracked something deeper, the illusion that slavery was eternal. For the first time, those in chains had walked as a people with purpose. For the first time, the masters had seen fear in their own eyes. 25 years later, the British Empire would abolish slavery throughout its territories. When that decree reached South Africa in 1834, some said it was the echo of a man's last words carried by the wind. Louis van Mauritius did not live to see freedom, but he had named it, and names have power. He stood for the dignity of those written out of history, for the belief that even silence can rebel, that courage can bloom in fields of despair. Every movement that came after every whisper, every petition, every act of defiance grew from the seed he planted. Freedom is not a gift. It is a road built by those who walked toward death and kept walking. And somewhere, beneath the soil of the Cape, the earth still remembers his footsteps.